So it's time to dust off the Sitrep crystal ball once again. The Chief of the Defence Staff says more Britons must be ready to fight to protect our homeland. The new head of MI6 says we are already operating in a space between peace and war, and President Putin says it's all hysteria. But his war in Ukraine is grinding on. Fighting may have largely stopped in Gaza, but the peace is fragile. And we've had a brutal reminder that the threat from Islamist-inspired terrorism has not gone. So what could the next 12 months bring for our defence, our armed forces and the world?
A world where terrorists plot against us, where our enemies fearmonger, bully and manipulate, and the front line is everywhere.
The prospect of any serious state-on-state conflict remains low in absolute terms, but high in relative terms.
Defense Explained.
If Ukraine fails, it'll be because we failed. And then Russia will force tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops into the Red Army.
If there's peace in Ukraine, then this deterrence force goes in.
We shouldn't be surprised if quite a lot of the armed forces end up in Ukraine in 2026 or 27.
This is Sitrep with Kate Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
Another year older. Are we another year wiser going into 2026, Mike?
Well, we are in a way, because this time last year we were all wondering what the presence of Donald Trump on the world stage would be, because that's been the big game changer in many conflicts that we're thinking about, for good and bad. And we all were thinking it through before Christmas last year. And we were saying, well, there's a sort of left of arc and right of arc. So left of arc is very bad and right of arc is surprisingly not too bad, maybe even better. And we were all thinking, where would the needle land? Well, the needle has stayed on left of arc, as bad as we could have imagined, actually. And so we know that. So we're wiser. We know where we are now in terms of Europe. And it is pretty bad, and we've got to face that. And a lot of the press seem to assume that everyone was stunned by Donald Trump. I don't think they've been stunned. They're disappointed in the way he's approached world politics, and particularly those that matter to the democratic world. But we're not terribly surprised. It's just disappointing. That's where we are. So, yeah, we're wiser in the situation in which we find ourselves. And it means that next year is going to be even more challenging than this year.
And we have a whole world to cover, but we will start by focusing on what 2026 holds for our defence and armed forces in the UK. And before I ask for your predictions, I thought we should hear from the very top of the armed forces. Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Knighton offered this pretty stark assessment of what 2026 may hold in his first Russi Christmas lecture as Chief of the Defence Staff.
The world's largest crowdsourcing forecasting site, Metaculus, suggests that there is a 16% probability Russia and any NATO member state are in direct conflict by 2027. So to put this in context, over the weekend, the bookies were saying that there was a 4% chance of Liverpool winning the Premier League. So even saying the chances are remote does not mean the chances are zero. My point is that none of us can say with any certainty what the absolute risk might be. And even though simple binary statements might be easy for people to engage with, they risk instilling panic or complacency. What really matters is the trend. Are the chances of conflict growing? And here I think the evidence is clear that the trend from Russia in particular is worsening. And that is the key argument for action.
Well, that's a bold figure to share. A predicted 16% chance, nearly 1 in 6 of direct conflict between Russia and a NATO nation in 2026. How concerned are you hearing that, Mike?
We shouldn't get too hung up on percentages when we're thinking about these things. I mean, I think what the CDS was saying is that we can't regard it as a negligible possibility. That's the point. It's not the most likely outcome, but it's not negligible. And in a way, he was trying to put a sort of a figure on what a lot of defence chiefs have been saying. Mark Rutte only this week was saying, we have to be prepared, we, the Europeans, to countenance the sort of warfare that our grandparents and great-grandparents lived through. And some said that he was overstating it. But it was the same sort of message. John Healey said the same thing, our own Defence Secretary. A lot of leaders are saying that we cannot now regard the prospect of war with Russia as remote. It is not the most likely outcome, but it's not negligible. And whether you put a percentage chance on it or not, a small possibility of a major disaster is worth taking very seriously.
And I'm just going to give some context for this 16% figure. It comes from Metacalculus, a respected online tool which generates forecasts based on the thoughts of its contributors. It did, for example, correctly identify February 24th, 2022 as the most likely date for a Russian invasion of Ukraine, 2 weeks before it happened. Flip the prediction over, Mike, and that's an 84% chance we won't have direct conflict with Russia next year, at least.
Yeah, well, we may not. And, it depends what we mean by direct conflict. I think we're in conflict with Russia now on a daily basis because they are involved in this sub-threshold warfare on every front against pipelines and internet cables, with sabotage, with subversion, with a whole sort of social media campaign. So we're dealing with that all the time. I suspect we won't get through next year without some sort of confrontation with Russia, but whether that becomes highly militarized or not will depend. But I think we are certainly heading for a moment when we dig our toes in on something and the Russians dig their toes in, and we'll see where that gets us.
Well, as always, we've turned to some of Sitrep's most well-informed and trusted friends to share their thoughts on what lies ahead in 2026, starting with two people who have been hands-on in the UK Armed Forces but now observe from somewhat different perspectives.
My name is General Sir Richard Barons. I'm a former commander of Joint Forces Command, and I'm now co-chairman of Universal Defence and Security Solutions.
Hi, I'm Dom Nichols, Associate Editor for Defence at The Telegraph. I think it's been a turbulent year. I mean, the military has been very active, as it always is, but at what cost?
So I think the state of Britain's armed forces as we end 2025 is the armed forces have got to adjust themselves, as frankly does the rest of UK civil society and industry, to a world where we have to contemplate that we could end up going to war. And in order to avoid that, we have to deter at the level of the credible ability to fight.
If we take the Navy, for example, they've just had a very successful trip around the world off to the Indo-Pacific and back. But the question now is, how long would it take for the Royal Navy to be able to do something like that again?
Closing the gap between where we are and where we have to get to is not a matter of just filling in holes in the way we might have done in the 1990s. This is about transformation, because we're talking about war in the 21st century, in the digital age. We need to remember deterrence is a thing. The armed forces are doing that every day. We've now got to do it at a higher level.
If there's peace in Ukraine, then this deterrence force goes in, this coalition of the willing, whatever it's going to be called. It needs to deter Russia and reassure Ukraine. And of course, it would be all services involved, but primarily the army as part of the land campaign.
One day, in some way, this war will stop. The fighting will stop. What's impossible to judge is that in 2026 or 2027? But to some degree, for the UK Armed Forces, it doesn't really matter, because whenever it stops, the Prime Minister has said the UK will play a role in this coalition of the willing, of underpinning the security of Ukraine in the future.
The size of the army means what would it be able to put in the field on an enduring basis? Certainly not a division, almost certainly not a brigade, so a battalion, a battle group, probably. But I mean, how much of a deterrence and reassurance is one battle group, admittedly part of a much wider construct?
We shouldn't be surprised if quite a lot of the armed forces end up in Ukraine in 2026 or 2027. And when they go, I think their role has to be providing credible deterrence in support of Ukraine with partners. I don't think going on a training mission with a guarantee that if the shooting starts again, that you just leave is going to fly.
I think the RAF, if called upon to do anything, it would be the most likely task I see is to backfill any withdrawal of US support. I mean, we're not going to be able to backfill US support completely, but would the RAF, in concert with allies, be able to put up a good enough force of ISR and space-based assets to continue the provision of intelligence to Ukraine? I don't know the answer to that.
If the UK and other forces do end up in Ukraine, Russia won't relish that, and it will poke back at the UK directly, certainly below the level of military conflict. So all that Russian activity in cyberspace and social media and disruption, I think, will ramp up as part of the UK's decision, the right one in my mind, to settle and help Ukraine.
There's an awful lot of activity that continues in the background, and some of these big exercises, the very big multinational, international exercises, I mean, they don't just happen. I mean, they take a huge amount of planning. We still have a commitment to Kosovo, still have a commitment to Cyprus. All these things are still there. I mean, they may only be down at company group size deployments, but just carrying on with what is normal activity now for the armed forces is increasingly logistic heavy.
I think the most important thing is for the armed forces to be infused with this idea that we live in this much harder world, and we're talking about war again. And that means being not just good warriors abroad, which we're used to doing, but recognizing the whole homeland is vulnerable again. And therefore we need to think about how we could mobilize, operate and endure in a situation where the homeland is being attacked.
That was General Sir Richard Barrons and Dom Nichols there. Mike, they very much echo what the Chief of Defence Staff said in his speech. He said he was making an argument for action. How might action look in 2026?
Yes, I mean, what Richard and Dominic said was quite sobering in those little extracts, quite scary stuff in a way. And I think there's two elements to this in terms of what 2026 might bring for the armed forces. One is, I think they're absolutely right that Ukraine will be our focus, whether in Ukraine or for Ukraine. I suspect it'll be for Ukraine rather than in Ukraine, but we'll see how that works out. And I suspect that the Air Force and maybe the Navy might be more involved than the ground forces in this case, but that's to be decided. But a lot of our immediate operational issues, I think, will revolve around Ukraine as the front line now of European security. And then behind that, activity next year will be transformational. We'll be trying to drive, or the services will be trying to drive the transformation towards from 5th to 6th generation warfare, or in some cases, I have to say, from 4th generation to 5th to 6th generation warfare. And this transformational mission is absolutely key to the ability of Britain and its allies in Europe to be able to fight and thereby deter a more general war. So I think there's the operational requirement will be Ukraine, and the structural requirement will be transformation. And that means many, many things across the armed forces, but that will be the buzzword, I think, during next year and the year after, transformation.
And indeed, after 4 years, I'm sure I don't need to explain much more just how much our defence and the job of the armed forces depend on what happens in Ukraine. And it feels like we have more questions than ever to address. That is why BFBS Forces News Ukraine reporter Simon Newton is with us. Simon, hello again.
Hi, hello.
Is Ukraine in a worse or better place going into 2026 than it was in 2025?
I think if you put the politics aside, the conclusion seems to be that they are not in a worse place, but they're definitely not in a better place than they were this time last year. If you look at a kind of binary assessment, there's been no major Ukrainian breakthrough. Russia's taken about 2,000 square miles this year. They occupy about 44,000 square miles in total now, which is about 20%, I think, of the country, as compared to 19% or so last year. So there's an incremental change there. The Ukrainian losses do seem to have risen quite substantially this year. You know, we're reading figures of 80,000 plus dead now on the Ukrainian side. The manpower side for Ukraine is definitely worse, I think, than it was this time last year. That seems to be a continuing problem. And one thing is also that in the drone game, the whole cat and mouse that's been going on there, Ukraine was definitely ahead probably at this point last year. The Russians have caught them up and in fact overtaken them in many ways, and they're proving very good, very adept at countering Ukrainian tech very quickly. So that's the kind of negative side. On the positive side, there's been no collapse. They're still inflicting huge casualties on the Russians in places like Pokrovsk. They've lost territory, but not a huge amount. They're still getting the same amount of money. The $45 billion that they've received this year is pretty much the same as they got last year. So that flow is still happening, that funnel. which does suggest that the Europeans are pitching in more to cover this shortfall. And also, you've got a lot of homegrown weapons coming on stream for Ukraine. I think about 60% of their weapons production is now domestic. And you've got things like Flamingo, their own homegrown kind of cruise missile coming on stream. And they've got more AI going into their weaponry. So that's definitely next year. That's going to be very much a focus, I think, for their weapons development on the battlefield. So as I go back to the beginning, really not in a worse place, but definitely not in a better place.
And Mike, Russia looks to have the military momentum right now. What would it take for Ukraine to get that momentum back in 2026?
Well, two or three different things, I think. One is that their manpower is a main issue. So they need to look again at their mobilization. And that's a big issue that we've spoken about before. They need to mobilize more of their own manpower. They need, secondly, more ammunition, more weapons, in order to try to reverse the momentum, push the Russians back somewhere. They need different sorts of weapons, and they need to be able to reorganize their forces a little bit. And then the third thing, I think, which is one of the most important of all, is that they need more political, moral support from outside. Again, the election of Donald Trump was pretty fundamental because it effectively, the United States has almost changed sides in the war, since it's now arguing for surrender as the only way of creating peace. And the Ukrainians are faced with Russian demands being, as it were, funneled through Washington. And that is hugely destabilizing and demoralizing for the Ukrainian public and the armed forces. So the sense that the outside world really does still care what happens, and even if America is going to turn away from it, the Europeans will not. And that's a really important element in fighting power, the sense that they're not fighting entirely on their own, that there are people behind them who are prepared to do, according to our leaders, whatever it takes. Well, next year we're going to have to find out what that really means.
So, Simon, you talk to the people of Ukraine. Have you got any idea what the morale is like at the moment? What are they telling you?
Well, I think very much reflecting what Mike's saying. I think they do feel left alone, and they do wonder definitely what the future holds, both politically and militarily. They worry about this flow of weaponry. They worry about, they want things like Tomahawk. They want Taurus, if we're talking about things that they want for next year, big weapons that are going to make potentially a big difference. Mike was talking about manpower there. Which we were saying that the fixer that I use in Ukraine has just been taken off the street in Kharkiv and put into the army. The manpower issue is a massive one for them. They've got 500,000 Ukrainian men at least sort of in hiding or have fled abroad to avoid conscription. They somehow have to try and turn that around. They had 9 million-ish men of conscription age at the start of this war, and 500,000 of them have fled. So that is going to be a big problem for them. But I think, reflecting what Mike said, definitely they worry that they're going to be just left to deal with this on their own.
And Mike, any idea what Ukraine's military objectives for 2026 are, and thoughts on what they should be?
Well, the Ukrainians, they want a ceasefire, but they want it on better terms than are being offered at the moment, for sure. So in a way, to make the Russians keen on a ceasefire, they need to push them back somewhere. If the Russians started to lose some of the territory that they've taken in the last 4 years, but even some of the territory they've taken in the last 18 months, if it began to reverse, then the political situation would start to look different. So if it were me, the strategic objectives I would try to set would be to hold around the front and then find the right places for a strategic offensive which hurt the Russian position. You can't throw the Russians all the way out, but if you could throw them back somewhere, and again it comes back to if you could get to the south towards the Sea of Azov and threaten Crimea, that would be a big strategic advantage to the Ukrainians, because that would really worry the Russians if Crimea became unviable as a military base, as it almost is now, but also as a place for immigrant Russians to live, or incoming Russians to live, 800,000 of them there since 2014, then that would be something that would give a big bargaining chip to Ukraine. So that's the sort of strategic objective they might aim for. And that also might affect the view of the outside world, because one of the big victories of this year for the Russians hasn't been victory on the battlefield. It's been a victory of the narratives. They have won the battle of the narratives fairly decisively by frightening a lot of people in Europe and convincing a lot of people in America that they are somehow unstoppable. And we've heard from Putin even this week. He said, if you don't give me what I want, I'll simply take it. I am unstoppable. That was the thought behind his latest speech in the last 24 hours. We cannot be stopped, so I'll either take it or you give it to me.
And Simon, how do Ukraine's forces look right now to deliver the kind of strategy that Mike was outlining? Well,
they're stretched, and the manpower issue is significant on the front line. They rely a lot on drones. We read a lot about these kill zones, these 10-kilometre deep kill zones that they have to use to basically keep the Russians at bay. The Russians are using these different tactics of infiltration, like we've seen in Pokrovsk of late. So I think they are low on numbers. They will try and see this winter out. And I've had, like Mike says, I've seen talk of them possibly launching some sort of Crimea offensive. I personally, Mike will know more than me, but I can't see that happening at the moment. But, we've been surprised by them before in Kursk and other places, and, they are very adept at that. So who knows?
Yeah, I would say, Simon, I don't think they've got any chance of launching that sort of an offensive now or even maybe in the spring. But if you had to devise a strategy going forward, what would you like them to be able to do that's within the realms of the just about possible? I think that's what it would be. A strategy which is realistic enough to work towards, but it won't be anything that they could create immediately. I'm sure.
At the moment they're focused on trying to hold this fortress belt and defend Kupiansk and other areas. That seems to be enough for them to do at this very point in time. I just can't see how they would take on anything of that size.
It's quite interesting because earlier on in the war, we were talking very much about Crimea, weren't we? And the fact that the Kerch Bridge whether it could or could not be cut off and the consequences of that. And that kind of discussion has suddenly gone right down the agenda, hasn't it?
But do you think, Mike, if Taurus or Tomahawk was available, if they did get Taurus and they got Tomahawk, that Crimea offensive idea would be much more plausible?
Yes, the idea of putting pressure on Crimea would be much more plausible if they had enough of them. But again, one missile type isn't going to do it. It's got to be part of a combined operation. Again, pushing south from Orikhiv to get them close enough to Crimea to really menace the place from a military point of view. That's a plausible scenario maybe for sometime next year if they were able to hold on to what they've got now and find other ways of relieving the pressure. But, as the old phrase goes, that if you're surrounded, you've got to outgun them somewhere. You've got to find some pressure point that gives the opposition reasons to worry that they're about to lose something important.
Of course, trying to predict the peace process is arguably harder than trying to predict what might happen on the battlefield. But even if the talking doesn't end with some kind of ceasefire, how much is at stake in how that talking progresses? Because it could shape US support or otherwise, Mike.
Yes, it could. And that's why we're at a really key moment now over Christmas this year, because I think that the so-called peace process will fail. Or if it succeeds, it will succeed in a way that is very bad for Ukraine and will be very difficult for Ukraine to establish itself as a viable entity afterwards. But I suspect it will fail. And then in January, we'll be faced with whatever the consequences are of President Trump's reaction to that. Now, maybe he'll be angry with Ukraine and the Europeans. Possibly he'll be angry with Putin because, even the MAGA Republicans must be able to see that Putin is giving absolutely nothing. The Russian statements at the moment are that they want absolutely everything they've demanded and they're completely uncooperative in terms of negotiations. Whether underneath the surface they're prepared to give something, we will find out. If I was the Russians, I'd actually give a little bit to see how far I could get Trump, as it were, angry with Ukraine. But what is going to happen over the next 2 or 3 weeks, let's say by the middle of January, will be absolutely critical to the way the American president, looks at this war going forward for the foreseeable future into 2026 and 2027.
And Mike, what if the peace process drags out? Because you've already talked about the damage to morale from the last year of uncertainty.
Yes, and it is damaging. in a way, I think a lot of Ukrainians have already priced that in. I mean, on the ground, Ukrainians say, well, we don't really believe it's going to happen. And if it does happen, it won't be to our advantage. We've got no choice but to carry on. The big sort of what if question is, what do the Europeans do? And will the Europeans stand up with Ukraine at the risk of fracturing the Atlantic alliance? Or for the sake of just trying to hold on to America's coattails, will they actually push Ukraine into an even worse situation on the ground, or allow Ukraine to be pushed into a worse situation? So I think that this third round of the circle, as it were, we went round the circle once in April, we went round it again in August, we're going round the same circle again in November, December. When we get to the top again, when we get back to the starting point and it's failed, the question for the Europeans is, who do we lean towards? And it's as big a question for the Europeans as I can imagine in the last 40 or 50 years.
Simon, I've asked you this before, but not for a while. If we do get to a point where US support is cut off, is the rest of NATO any better placed now than it was a year ago to fill the gaps?
I think I'll probably just fudge this somewhat and say I'm not really sure. I mean, Europe gives Ukraine a lot of stuff. Obviously, it gives them ammunition, vehicles, things like Storm Shadow. But in certain areas, particularly in air defense, they need American kit. They rely heavily on American kit, like Patriot, for instance. They also rely on US intelligence very heavily for both detecting incoming attacks and also for some of their targeting inside Russia. Trump has slashed the monetary flow to Ukraine, and he's turned it into this transactional agreement, effectively, where Europe's now buying weaponry from the Americans, which then goes to Ukraine. But Ukraine did get 45 billion in aid this year, which is pretty much the same as last year. So Europe is somehow making up that shortfall. Could Ukraine fight on without the US and just European support? I think yes, they could, but it would be more precarious. They produce, as I said earlier, about 60% of their own weaponry now domestically, but the remaining 40% of that, a lot of that 40% comes from the Americans. So, in answer to your question, I think yes, Europe has stepped up, but it would be very difficult for them if the America completely walked away. But I think Ukraine would fight on.
And the big what if that General Barrons and Dom Nichols talked about there, if there really is a peace deal which comes into being, how big is the military effort required from the UK and the rest of NATO? And are we all up to it, Mike?
Not at the moment. When you say all of us, all of European NATO certainly isn't. But the North European members, who I call the toughies in NATO, who are, the Scandinavian countries, the Baltic states, Denmark, Netherlands, Britain, Germany, Poland, those are the toughies. They're up for it, but they're still mobilizing quite slowly, and their own defense production is moving more quickly, but not quickly enough. I mean, the Germans just this week the Bundestag agreed to put 50 billion into defence procurement, 50 billion euros into defence procurement. But that doesn't pay off for at least about 18 months before it begins to create scale in the sort of things they need. So they're all moving in the right direction, but it would be a sort of a really difficult time hanging on without American support, trying to keep Ukraine going whilst we ramp up, even as quickly as the Germans are now saying they're going to ramp up. That's still puts us into 2027, 28 before things start to look better, at least from our point of view.
I mean, the groundwork is underway. I think they're talking about there being a headquarters for this in Paris, I think, and it will be led by, in terms of this force, we have to call it a multinational force, I think now. A multinational force Ukraine rather than a peacekeeping force seems to be the wording they like to use. And it would be headed by a British two-star, a major general. But as Mike says, the Americans are saying they're not going to effectively take part. And then you go back to General Barron's point, which is if you've got 10 to 30,000 troops on the ground, they have to be willing to fight. And that poses a big question, I suppose, of whether you can actually set that up without having the Americans involved effectively anyway.
Well, we'll hear a little later from retired US Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, but it's worth mentioning now a point he did make when we were talking earlier this month. His prediction is if Russia were to get part of Ukraine, Moscow would use that as people and resources to regenerate military capability, and that would increase the potential risks of an attack on NATO. If that happens, Mike, how soon would we be having to factor it into our calculus?
Well, I think we are now, actually, in the sense that the Russian pressure is going to increase whatever happens in Ukraine. So if there is a settlement in Ukraine and the Russians then are able to, as Ben Hodges said, use Ukrainian resources, that will all go towards the pressure that the Russians will then put on other areas in Europe that we know that they're interested in, and interested in breaking the NATO alliance more fundamentally, which they now see they've got a chance of doing. And if there isn't a settlement in Ukraine, if the war goes on, then the Russians will maintain this level of hostility because the war is going on and because Britain is regarded by Moscow as the ringleader among the Europeans. It's not entirely true these days, but it certainly was in 2022, and the Russians don't forgive us for that. So in a way, we're already factoring in the idea that Russian pressure on Western Europe will increase whether or not there is a settlement in Ukraine. It will change if there is some sort of settlement, but it will not decrease in extent because the Russians have got a sense of momentum. They've got a militarized economy now. They've got a big ground forces unit. They've still got their Northern Fleet and their air forces in pretty good shape. And they've got this sense of mission now to break the power of the Western alliance, which, again, because of the election of Donald Trump, they now see as a distinct possibility.
And seeing as the Chief of Defence Staff has been quoting metacalculus, I thought it would be interesting to do the same now. Its current estimate of some kind of bilateral ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine is April 2027.
It's possible, yeah. I mean, if we put a percentage on it, I'd say it's sort of 50-50 if we're talking about, into 2027, because by then I think there'll be other factors, either Russian success or Russian exhaustion and Russian economic problems, which would make them more keen on a ceasefire. And the Ukrainians may feel that they've got no alternative, and the Europeans would certainly by then look for a ceasefire. So you could imagine, not next year, but into 2027, that there'll be a sense of agreement that wherever the front line is where it's going to stay for the foreseeable future. So I'd say that's maybe a 50-50 possibility.
And Simon, can Ukraine hold on that long militarily, and any estimates of what the state of the war would be this time next year if the fighting is still going on?
I think there's clearly going to be a lot more Russian dead at the rate that they're going at the moment. That would be one major factor. I think in terms of the trajectory of the war, there's lots of factors, as Mike just said. Can Putin sustain this war economically for another 12 months? Seems to be holding on. The attacks on the oil and gas terminals, which are obviously the main financial source for Russia. They've lost a lot of. I mean, I was reading one thing. They've lost 14,000 tanks and armored vehicles in this war. The Russians. If you compare that, we're getting 148 Challenger 3s. That just puts that into context in terms of what we're talking about in terms of scale. So I think in terms of the Ukrainians, they will fight on. They've shown how resourceful, how innovative they are. The question for me, and I'm interested in Mike's view of this, I guess there could be a school of thought that will Putin, will he still pursue this idea of taking the whole of Ukraine? I know he sees Kyiv as some sort of mythical birthplace of Mother Russia, but he'll never accept anything like defeat. But will he, if he could take Donetsk and Luhansk, for instance, and he could say he's denazified the Donbass, which is one of obviously the sort of stated aims.
Would that be enough?
Would he put the brakes on at that point?
Yeah, one of the things that I'm hearing from Kyiv is that what Putin wants is a victory parade in Kramatorsk. And that if he could say we have the Donbass, although it's not what he wants in the sense that we know he wants the whole of Ukraine, but he would have reasons then to pause and to say, well, I've done the main part of what I wanted and we've had a victory parade in Kramatorsk. And there would also be an incentive politically for him to keep quiet as far as Ukraine goes for 3 years more or 2 years more until the end of the Trump administration, because he's got a partnership to build with Washington, and that he'd bide his time in the rest of Ukraine, say until 2028, if he had the Donbass next year. And then, Russian pressure would then be on other areas in Europe and on the rest of us. And again, as I said, trying to break the Western alliance much more fundamentally than it's already beginning to fracture. So there is a thought that, yes, Putin might actually be prepared to pause if he could trumpet the Donbass as his victory and, let his economy recover a little bit from the efforts of the last 4 years.
That is one heck of a sobering thought to leave this discussion on Ukraine for the moment. But thank you, Simon, for joining us. And there's no doubt that Ukraine remains our biggest defence concern, but it does not make us immune from what's happening elsewhere, near or far. So let's hear from another of Sitrep's good friends about where the next big conflict might be and the state of the world heading into 2026.
I'm Shashank Joshi, defence editor at The Economist. It's been a really tumultuous year again, and when I think back, I think primarily to three really big conflicts. One of them is, of course, the bombing of Iran by America and Israel, which was a momentous event. The other is, of course, the ongoing Ukraine conflict, but also the acceleration of diplomacy around that conflict, and that's been a really significant development, I think. And I think the third one that comes to mind is India-Pakistan, which, of course, fought a brief air and missile campaign for several days, one which was the most far-reaching India-Pakistan war since 1971. I think the prospect of any serious state-on-state conflict in 2026 that is on top of those that we've already discussed remains low in absolute terms, but high in relative terms, by which I mean it's lower than 50%. But of course, I think it is going up. And when I look at the list of potential conflicts, first of all, the prospect of a resumption in fighting between Israel and Iran, particularly if Iran seeks to rebuild its missile program, as it is doing now. I think the Iranian regime is still in a process of licking its wounds, of rebuilding the things that it lost. It's just weak, its economy is in trouble, its politics is divided. I think it will be trying to actually seek a kind of pact, a deal with America over its nuclear program. It really will not want a war that could see its regime severely weakened and depleted again. One of the questions will be around the prospect of an international force inside Gaza. Who will contribute to it? Who will take the risk of putting their forces on the ground? Are they willing to take the risk of attempting to disarm Hamas, and a group that will resist disarmament? I think also the other question is how far Israel will test the boundaries of this ceasefire. We've already seen Israel conduct a strike inside Gaza recently that caused a lot of, I think, opposition from Arab states, saying Israel is playing fast and loose with the terms of the ceasefire. So this is a very fragile agreement, and I think there's no guarantee it will hold through 2026 at all. I'm reasonably optimistic about Syria. Of course, we did see the new regime consolidate itself. Extraordinary diplomatic normalization of this regime, with Sharar even visiting Donald Trump and looking, cordial and jokey with him. On the other hand, we've also seen really unpleasant massacres take place of minorities in Syria on the coast. So there are these simmering ethnic tensions, these sectarian tensions in Syria. But by and large, although Israel is pushing into Syria, carving out buffer zones, bombing sites in Syria, and that will be a source of continued tension, I'm optimistic about the political direction of Syria and the fact that it will, I think, not relapse into a state of complete civil conflict, which very much would have been a possibility looking at this from the vantage point of a year ago. In the Pacific, the South China Sea, particularly in those jockeying for advantage around those contested China-Philippines territories, notably Second Thomas Shoal, which is a Filipino-controlled reef in the South China Sea, but China has repeatedly challenged the Philippines' control of that. And that has looked very, very tense this year. And again, if I was looking at potential flashpoints for 2026, I would certainly have that high on my list. And I guess the final one I'd just add is the prospect of an escalation, you could say, between China and Japan, where tensions have been rising in the East China Sea, a part of the world where we perhaps don't pay as much attention, notably around the Senkaku Islands. And that has come about as a result of Japan's Prime Minister talking more publicly about the role that Japan might play for the defense of Taiwan, and China has responded very aggressively. I'd expect some of those tensions to continue into 2026. It's always the small wars that tend to surprise us. From a European perspective, you would be looking at North Africa, and particularly the rise of jihadists in North Africa, filling vacuums left by the withdrawal of French forces, the distraction of American forces, Russia and Russian mercenaries supporting them. And I think that jihadist resurgence in North Africa, particularly in the Sahel, is a source of severe concern to those southern European countries like Italy looking down across the Mediterranean. We've seen how jihadist activity just recently in ISIS-inspired attack in Bondi Beach in Sydney still can surprise us, can still has the capacity to seize the headlines. And is that more than a large, Russian attack, I think, that would be the focus for the first part of 2026?
That was Shashank Joshi, defence editor of The Economist. Mike, it's an interesting final point there. Have we taken our eye off the ball in terms of the global terrorist threat to us at home? And are we going to have to ramp back up in that space?
Well, we shouldn't ignore it. Yeah, it was interesting, that we had this discussion around the preparations for the Strategic Defence Review, and we talked quite a lot about terrorism, because traditionally terrorism rises and falls. It never really has a big strategic effect, even though it can affect individual issues quite severely, and it can affect individual countries. But it never is a big strategic determinant in world politics. Well, that now seems to be changed, partly because terrorism is so much more possible in the modern world, and with the role of the internet and the availability of materials and destructive power. And I think the decision that we came to, or the view that most people took in the discussions I was involved in, is that we have to regard terrorism as a continuing problem, a structural disjuncture in world politics. And it doesn't always mean jihadi terrorism. At the moment, it seems to bother us for all the obvious reasons. But it's just terrorism as a technique isn't now something that rises and falls and comes and goes. It's always there, and it can be mobilized much more easily than was the case 40 or 50 years ago, let alone a century ago. And it's not going to go away.
And that whole China-Taiwan situation, it's tempting to see it as the dog that never barks. That risks complacency, though. Will that dog stay down at the level of growling in 2026?
Well, I think it will in the case of the China-Taiwan, because I think China doesn't want to invade Taiwan particularly because it's a difficult job. But it does want to pressure Taiwan. I think we'll see military pressure, what I call the anaconda strategy, always kind of squeezing and then letting go, squeezing and letting go, in order to persuade the Taiwanese that this will carry on until they make some sort of political decision to rejoin mainland China. So I don't think that's going to change too much in 2026. But I think that Shashank Joshi is dead right, looking at the South China Sea. If you're looking for where there might be incidents, the South China Sea. And he also mentioned the Senkaku Islands, the Diaoyu Islands, as they're called in China. Senkaku is the Japanese name for them, the Diaoyu Islands in China. And they've always been a bone of contention, but they're a real bone of contention now for all sorts of other reasons. So I think that there's particular flashpoints around Senkaku, Diaoyu Islands, and in the South China Sea, not so much in Taiwan. But those flashpoints might be with us in 26, 27, whereas I think Taiwan will be an issue for the 2030s, probably.
And can I just get your thoughts closer to home? Are there potential flashpoints we should be watching out for in Europe? I know you pay particular interest to Georgia, for example.
Yes. Georgia is being drawn further into the Russian sphere by the Georgia Dream government there, which is a Russian puppet, and it's supported and funded by the Russians. And the civil disobedience campaign, keeps on running, but can't really make enough impression on that. If they did begin to succeed, I think the Russians would move in. More immediately than Georgia next year, I think Moldova is under great pressure. If you look at Moldova, it is a carbon copy of the Donbass in 2014. It's exactly the same conditions which the Russians could use to create a sense of disorder, followed by the arrival of little green men, followed by the arrival of more regular forces to try to control the whole place. That's a big issue. And I think the Baltic states, and we're talking here about NATO territory, but particularly Estonia and Latvia, are replete with pressure points that the Russians may try to use. And certainly the Estonians and the Latvians take very seriously the prospect of destabilization, not a Russian invasion, but destabilization leading to Russian paramilitary involvement, which would set the scene then for a more obvious challenge to Article 5 of NATO at a time when NATO may not be in a position to do very much about it. So those are the things I particularly worry about, in that order really. Moldova, Georgia, the Baltics. Those are the three in Europe that I worry about. And then the fourth one is not in quite the same category, but Eastern Mediterranean. The Eastern Mediterranean is replete with tensions. I won't try and go into them, but it's like a trap ready to spring. It's a spring-loaded trap, and it won't take much of a mouse to run across it to actually set the trap off.
And Mike, what does happen from our side if Moldova does get the little green men?
Then we have to decide whether to intervene on behalf of a democratic government in a non-NATO country. And that would be a big decision. Moldova is a small country. It would not be impossible to defend at all. And the Romanians worry a lot about Moldova because it used to be part of Romania. So I think that would be a really difficult moment of truth, as it were. If we saw a rerun of the Donbass in Moldova, would we just confine ourselves to protesting, or would we say, no, this has gone too far, we will now intervene on behalf of the democratic government? I don't know how that would play out. How that decision will be taken, I really can't predict.
OK, we'll save that then and keep our eyes on it. Of course, despite the diplomatic rollercoaster we've been on in 2025, our defence and security in 2026 will remain heavily tied to the US and decisions taken there. It is no surprise, after nearly a year of Donald Trump's second presidency, that the new US national security strategy has Europe pretty much at the bottom of its priority list. But how will that turn into military reality in 2026? And what does the rest of NATO need to do alongside that?
My name is Ben Hodges, Lieutenant General, U.S. Army, retired. Despite all of the noise and the bad news, the fact is the number of U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Force that are still based in Europe is about the same. The only things that I've seen different from that were the announcement a few weeks ago that the U.S. will not replace one of the battalions they have in Romania as part of a rotational force. The more concerning things are the fact that European allies are beginning to show concern about sharing intelligence with the United States for a variety of reasons. So I'm concerned that the confidence that our allies have in us has been damaged. The Pentagon has not yet released their newest national defense strategy, but the number one priority is going to be Western Hemisphere. So North America, Central and South America. That will be the priority from a defense and security standpoint. Second priority will be the Indo-Pacific region. Third priority would be the Middle East, specifically Israel, Iran, and surrounding area. And then a fourth would be Europe. Now, if this was normal times, that would not be such a terrible thing, because it is a recognition that more European countries have stepped up their contributions, their own investment in their own defense. They have more capability. So you could see that this is exactly where that should be. But unfortunately, this is happening at a time when Russia has attacked a European country, Ukraine, and we have the largest land war in Europe since the end of the Second World War. That's the wrong time for the United States to be signaling that somehow Europe is not as important to us as it used to be. And of course, the Chinese are watching, and they're seeing that the U.S. under this administration looks kind of flexible when it comes to sovereignty, for example. And we look very, very transactional. The outcome of all this is going to be lost U.S. influence, but also Europeans realizing that they will have to, and they can defend themselves without much U.S. involvement. The best way to defend Europe is to help Ukraine defeat Russia, but learning from them and figuring out how does Europe protect itself from drones, disinformation, all the gray zone things, as well as massed artillery and rocket fire. Now, the second thing, the focus should not be only on modernization, buying new kit. I mean, that's obviously an important part of it, but the most important part is readiness, being able to do what your job is, your task, having units that are fully manned, that have trained, that you're doing exercises in very rigorous conditions. And it has to be real exercises where you train to the point of failure like a professional athlete. You know, if you don't reach that muscle failure point in every exercise, then you never know what still needs to be fixed. And this is where political leaders could provide some cover for military to do that. And then the third thing, of course, is the Russians know that NATO's deterrence and defense depends a lot on rapid response forces. So that means infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, airports, seaports, rail, bridges. These are going to be targeted in a massive way, both through cyber as well as kinetic strike. And so building up our defenses and our resilience in Central and Eastern Europe has to be a priority as well.
And Mike, we come full circle really to where we started, with the Chief of Defence Staff talking about our need to be better prepared to defend our own homeland. The demands on the men and women of the armed forces, Mike, they're not going to be easing off in 2026, are they?
No, certainly not. And, we always value our armed forces. We love our armed forces. Well, there's going to be reasons to value and love them even more next year, because they will be busy. And I think the nation understands better now than it did 12 months ago how much we need them and are going to need them. So I think, there will be a new atmosphere, I think, towards the armed forces, certainly among the public, during 2026.
And how are you feeling about the year ahead? Our conversations often focus on the risks. Do you see any optimism anywhere?
Well, yes, I was quite taken by Ben Hodges' optimism there, in the sense that he's full of ideas about what the Europeans need to do. And I think, most of the European governments, not all, do get that now. And I'm optimistic by the fact that we understand the situation we're in better now than we did a year ago. And when things get difficult, it clarifies the choices. I think the choices that Europe faces are, even though they're difficult choices, we can be more clear about now, because, we now know much more clearly what the Russians are up to and what they're doing and what they intend. We know what the challenges are. We know what we need to fix. So in a way, it simplifies some of the difficult choices which governments are going to have to make starting now.
And just on a final personal note, Mike, what are your goals for 2026? I seem to recall we talked this time last year about you starting work on a new book last Boxing Day.
Yes, British Women of Command. Yes, yeah. Oh, no, I'm doing it. That's right. No, the last book I did was Great British Commanders. And I've started work on British Women of Command. So I've been writing about the Celtic warrior queens, people like Cartamandua and Boudica, of course, but also Queen Sinrith of Mercia and Queen Sexburg of Wessex. So I've done the warrior queens and people like Margaret of Anjou and Empress Matilda. I'm coming up to the more modern people now. So I'm interested not just in women commanders, and there have been some, but also how women affected commands. In other words, where women had an effect on commanders, usually positive, but not always. And so, I'm working on that and enjoying it hugely as a break from thinking about world affairs.
I bet. Can't wait to talk to you about it when you finish the book, Mike. I better let you go. You're a busy man. Thank you so much. It's been great talking to you this year. Thanks to all of our guests as well. Those trusted, well-informed friends of Sitrep have had more and more thoughts than we had time to share. And so starting from Boxing Day, Mike will probably be working away on his book then. We'll be dropping extra editions of the Sitrep podcast each day where you can hear our conversations in full. Professor Michael Clarke and I will be back with another Sitrep on Thursday, the 8th of January. But of course, right through the holidays, you can stay up to date with all the latest defence news on our website, forcesnews.com. For now, though, from me, Kate Gerbeau, and the whole of the Sitrep team, we hope you have a Merry Christmas and, if at all possible, a peaceful New Year. Bye-bye.